He was polite, quiet, the kind of guy who wouldn't raise a fuss, even in prison, where he worked hard, learning the butcher's trade. But behind his calm exterior was something much darker, because the man who once carved meat in a prison kitchen would soon turn that skill on tourists, dismembering bodies with such precision that investigators thought the killer had to be a surgeon. When police in Singapore pulled a floating plastic bag from the waters near Clifford Pier in March 1995, they had no idea they were about to uncover one of the country's most gruesome murder cases. And at the heart of it all, posing as a tourist, using a fake name, was a fugitive who'd escaped more than once and left a trail of blood across 3 countries. This is the story of John Martin Scripps. Hello and welcome. If you enjoy my videos, then please do like, subscribe, and leave your thoughts on this case down below. Every time you do that, it really helps the channel out in the algorithm. Now, let's lift the thin veil. John Martin Scripps was born on December 9, 1959, in the quiet town of Letchworth, Hertfordshire, in England. His father, Leonard, was a lorry driver from London's East End, while his mother, Jean, ran a successful guest house on the Isle of Wight. Growing up as an only child, Scripps was especially close to his dad. His childhood was mostly filled with road trips and long-haul drives that felt like adventures. But that world came crashing down when he was just 9. His father took his own life, and with that single devastating moment, the road ahead for Scripps darkened permanently. This situation affected him to the extent that traveling and committing his violence would become a recurring theme for Scripps. Before his father's death, Scripps was known to be a good school student, but soon after, he began to show a lack of concern towards school and life itself. He mostly stopped talking to any of his friends and started to spend a lot more time on his own. At the age of 14, to address his behavioral problems, Scripps was sent to a cadet school in France. One night, he snuck out to find a girlfriend, breaking the strict curfew rules at his cadet school. And then, his behavior went from slightly naughty to much worse. In fact, he had his first encounter with the legal system at the age of 15, the following year when he returned to England. In May 1974, Scripps was sentenced to a 12-month conditional discharge and fined £10 for burglary. That's worth about $160 in today's money. But that sentence would do nothing to deter him from stealing again. It's worth pointing out that Scripps did not come from an impoverished background where he had to steal to survive. His mother's guest house business was actually relatively successful. His theft and behavioral problems arose only after his father's death. Scripps's disinterest in learning and difficulties with reading and writing led him to drop out of school at the age of 15. Following this, he traveled around England, sleeping rough and raising some money by doing odd jobs and selling antiques and other valuable items he'd usually obtained through theft. In the meantime, he'd faced 3 further sentences for burglary and was also fined for assaulting a police officer. By the age of 17, Scripps decided to pack his bags and fly abroad. It's not clear how he funded these trips, but it was likely through theft. He first headed to Israel, and what he did there is mostly unknown, but he spent some time in an Israeli jail for theft in 1980. Through his travels and hanging out with various career criminals, he decided that drug transport was the way he'd fund his lifestyle. Whilst traveling across Montreal, Canada, he met a girl called Maria Pilar Arellanos, who was on holiday but lived in Cancun, Mexico. The pair were enamored with each other and eventually got married and moved to London, England when Scripps was 21 and Maria was 19. They traveled around the world together, but Maria did not know what Scripps really did for a living. He had told her he was in the import-export business, which appeared to explain all the traveling and his procurement of random goods, which were actually stolen. An incident in London finally revealed to Maria who her husband really was. In 1982, he had gotten caught stealing yet again, and while the police officer was trying to apprehend him, he resisted and fought back. For this, Scripps was sentenced to 3 years in jail for 10 counts of theft and assaulting a police officer. Maria started to feel apprehensive about her marriage to a criminal, but it was June 1985 when she decided she ultimately wanted nothing to do with him. It's reported that in prison, Scripps was always a model prisoner, According to the staff, he was easy to deal with, helpful, and showed interest in doing various types of menial prison jobs, which allowed him free time outside of prison. In the UK, there used to be a process called day leave for prisoners who displayed good behavior and were sentenced for non-violent crimes. Close to the end of their sentence, they were allowed to leave prison for a day to meet friends and family and apply for jobs or further education. This process still exists to a limited extent and is called resettlement day release. This is important because Scripps would take advantage of this exact privilege. In June 1985, Scripps was granted day leave, and instead of heading back after his leave was over, he escaped. Not long afterwards, he was caught once again for theft. Scripps was given an additional 3-year sentence for escaping and theft, and Maria decided enough was enough. She filed for divorce and eventually got married to a police officer named Ken. This infuriated Scripps. Despite his earlier escape, the prison again granted him day release, and Scripps used it to track Maria down and attempted to kill her. Although he was unsuccessful in causing Maria and her new husband any physical harm, the incident hurt them enough that Maria ultimately decided to divorce Ken as well. Scripps made multiple attempts to win Maria back, which she rejected, and she eventually moved back to Mexico. Although Scripps legally changed his name from John Martin Scripps to just John Martin, I'll just refer to him as Scripps to keep it less confusing. This was done so there would be a lower chance of him being flagged at borders when traveling, because he had no plans to stop committing crimes. Upon his release early in 1987, he decided to continue to transport drugs overseas. He had developed a habit of using various drugs as well as making money from them. He had been mostly carrying heroin across Asia and Europe for a syndicate for only a short time when he was caught with suspicious amounts of cash and he was arrested for possession at Heathrow Airport in London in late 1987. The police found a key on him for a safety deposit box at a bank in Singapore. There, Singaporean police found a 1.5 kg heroin stash worth about $1 million. In 1987, that's about $3 million today. This was Scripps' biggest offense so far, with a corresponding sentence of 7 years starting in January 1988, but it wouldn't be long before he'd see freedom again, as for some reason, the prison authorities gave him a day leave yet again about 4 years into his prison sentence. Scripps escaped again briefly, but he was caught shortly afterwards, and a further 6 years was added to the remaining 3 years of his sentence, this time in HMP Albany on the Isle of Wight. Scripps would have been kept behind bars until 2001 had he not escaped again. In the late 1980s and early 1990s in the UK, prisoner work was mandatory for most inmates and focused more on discipline rather than rehabilitation. Jobs included cleaning, cooking, laundry, gardening, and basic manufacturing, often for minimal pay, just a few pounds a week. Work assignments were made by prison staff, and refusing could lead to punishment. But if prisoners displayed good behavior, they were rewarded with more free time and given more trust. Some roles were reserved for only the most trusted prisoners. Despite his multiple escapes, Scripps was otherwise a model prisoner, so much so that he was assigned the role of prison butcher. This granted him access to a vast array of dangerous tools. But it wasn't the tools that were the problem. It was whatever opened up inside of him as he learned how to dismember animal bodies and remove their bones. Scripps turned out to be quite proficient at butchering and told his trainer that he planned to start his own butchery when he was free. In 1993, Scripps' security categorization changed, meaning he was considered trustworthy enough to move to a lower security prison, HMP The Mount, in Hertfordshire, where he was once again given an opportunity to take day leave. This day leave was granted to Scripps just 2 days after he was refused parole because the prison determined he was likely to re-offend. The decision wasn't met without protest. In fact, Scripps' own mother wrote to the prison governor pleading not to give him any more leave, as she believed he was planning a big escape. Scripps had sold all of his belongings to other prisoners, which was a clear red flag that he did not plan to stay. However, the governor did not feel it was reason enough to revoke his leave, and on October 1994, Scripps walked through the prison gates for one last time. The dates are a bit unclear here, but it's believed that Scripps, along with the cash obtained from selling his belongings and some money given to him by his mother, left the UK for Mexico in pursuit of Maria. If you're wondering how he managed to travel as a wanted man, right before he left prison, he had stolen the birth certificate of a fellow inmate by the name of Simon Davis. Using this stolen birth certificate, Scripps was able to get a passport issued with a false name and leave the country unscathed. Upon arriving in Mexico, he applied for a new passport at the British Embassy under the name of John Martin. This likely didn't raise any red flags, as it predates the advanced flagging systems we have in place today. As for Maria, she made her intentions clear about not wanting to get back together with Scripps. There isn't much information on how he reacted to this, but he decided to travel the world for 4 months before arriving in Singapore on the 8th of March, 1995. Back then, Singapore was a city of just over 3 million people, known globally for its strict laws and remarkably low crime rate. There were only 76 reported murders that entire year, 2 per 100,000 people, compared to 8 per 100,000 in the US. It was a kind of place where violent crime was nearly unheard of, and the public felt safe walking the streets at any hour. But 5 days after Scripps had arrived in Singapore, on the 13th of March 1995, a plastic bag full of human body parts was found floating near the Clifford Pier, which at the time was commonly used by locals and tourists to ferry to the southern islands. The police were notified, and what they found inside already gave them a few clues. The body parts had been cut with extreme precision, clearly by someone very experienced with a knife. Immediately, they suspected the perpetrator was a surgeon or a butcher. The remains belonged to a Caucasian male, likely a foreigner, so the first thing the police did was cross-check them with any missing persons reports in the country. One name popped up: Gerard Lowe from South Africa. His wife, Vanessa Lowe, had called into the South African embassy just a few days earlier about not being able to get in touch with her husband, who was supposed to be in Singapore. The match was positive, and within days, police made a chilling discovery when they investigated what had happened during Gerard's brief trip before his life was taken. Gerard had left his home in Johannesburg, South Africa on the 7th of March 1995. He was a chemical engineer and needed to purchase equipment available exclusively in Singapore. Right before he left, though, he had given Vanessa his itinerary and told her, quote, "I will call you the moment I check into the hotel to give you the contact number," unquote. But sadly, Gerard would never make that call, and that would be the last time Vanessa would see Gerard alive. Gerard's records showed that he did arrive in Singapore Changi Airport as planned, but CCTV footage and his hotel records showed that he wasn't alone. Scripps also arrived at Singapore Changi Airport on the 8th of March, using his fake passport as Simon Davis. At some point in the airport, Scripps approached Gerard, and after what seemed like a friendly conversation, they had decided that in order to save money, it would be beneficial to share a hotel room. They managed to book room 1511 in the Riverview Hotel. This place is now a 4 Points by Sheraton Hotel. Within minutes of checking into the room, Scripps pulled out a stun gun he was traveling with, paralyzed Gerard, and then took his life with a hammer. He then stored Gerard's body, forged new identification documents by gluing his own photo on Gerard's passport, and stole his bank cards and traveler's checks. He then spent the day treating himself and lavishly spending Gerard's money, including on a $500 video camera, expensive shoes for his sister, and even attending a performance of the Singapore Symphony Orchestra. But Scripps didn't stop there. At this point, he had decided that killing tourists and stealing their money was an easy way to make a quick buck, and he needed to do it again. He withdrew thousands of dollars from Gerard's bank account and converted about $5,000 into traveler's checks to be sent to a bank account he'd set up in the US through travel agency Thomas Cook. This part will be important later. The transfer was meant to take a few days, and at that point, Scripps had decided to buy a ticket to Bangkok, Thailand, for the next evening. But he had one problem: Gerard's body in the hotel room's wardrobe. Upon returning that night to the hotel, Scripps took Gerard's body to the bathroom and cut it into many pieces. According to the hotel's security guard's account of the night's events, Scripps took several trips, dumping the remains in a nearby river. The morning after, during checkout, Scripps asked the hotel receptionist to delete Gerard's name from the room registration system. He told them he had kicked Gerard out the previous night for being a homosexual, which was illegal in Singapore at the time. Feeling clever for using a false name for his stay, Scripps thought he had gotten away with it, but besides all the witnesses at the hotel and airport and the CCTV footage, there was another problem. Scripps had left behind a duffel bag containing a can of body spray he used to mask the foul odor in the room, as well as plenty of DNA evidence of both himself and Gerard. Inside the room, although it looked clean, police found bloodstains near the toilet. They were able to match the DNA with Gerard's because his sister in South Africa had mailed in blood samples to help with the investigation. By this point, Scripps had escaped to Thailand, but he would return 4 days later on the 19th of March. We'll come back to this in a second. After confirming the visuals with who they thought was Simon Davis, because if you remember that he was traveling around the world as Simon Davis, the Singaporean police initially chose to remain quiet about the murderer at large. Because he was a foreigner and traveled internationally, they did not know where he was, and if he caught on, he might try to disappear. What they chose to do instead was red flag him at the airport, which basically meant that he would be pulled aside as soon as he tried to enter the country. He was caught in this way on the 19th of March as he was trying to pass through passport control at Singapore Changi Airport. The police held him for questioning for 48 hours and charged him with suspected forgery to keep him for an additional week, but Scripps did not say a single word. In his bag they found Simon Davis's birth certificate and several weapons, including a hammer, a stun gun, a can of mace, 2 pairs of handcuffs, a pair of thumb cuffs, 2 police brand foldable knives, an oil stone, and 2 Swiss Army knives. They also found 2 British passports, one issued to Simon Davis and one to John Martin, and a South African passport issued to Gerard Lowe with his own photo affixed on the ID page. But it wasn't until they found 2 more passports in his bag belonging to 2 Canadians, once again with Scripps's photo affixed on each, that they found out how much more twisted Scripps actually was. During his time in Thailand in a flight to Phuket from Bangkok, Scripps had met a mother and son named Sheila and Darren Demood. They were traveling for a family vacation, and Scripps decided to strike up a conversation with them. After discovering they were staying at Nilly's Marina Hotel, he decided to stay there as well, ensuring by request that his room was right across from theirs. Before the trio separated ways for the night, they agreed to meet for breakfast the next morning and spend the day together. Unfortunately, breakfast was not Scripps had in mind. The next morning at around 8 a.m., Scripps knocked on the Demood's door, and when he was let in, he spared no time before paralyzing them and bludgeoning both mother and son in the head with a hammer. Then he repeated the cycle of stealing their bank cards and any cash and forging their passports, and practiced forging their signatures so that he could access their bank accounts and traveler's checks. It took him less than an hour to dismember both bodies in the bathroom and dispose of them. Over the next few days, he spread the body parts across Phuket to ensure they wouldn't be identified, and although he had become a highly skilled killer, Scripps was not very intelligent. The legs, torso, and arms of each person would be found a few days later, once again cut extremely professionally. Eventually, the victims' heads were found as well, near an abandoned tin mine in the west of Phuket Island. Because the body parts were so decomposed, the police had to confirm their identities through dental records. When he checked out on the day he was due to fly to Singapore, Scripps told the hotel that Demoods had left suddenly and he would be settling their bill. Now you might be asking yourself, why on earth would Scripps fly back to Singapore and return to the scene of the crime? Obviously, he was a stone-cold killer, but why risk getting caught? Well, Scripps had gotten a call from the Thomas Cook travel agency saying that there was a problem with the transfer he'd done a few days earlier and that he'd need to return to the branch in Singapore for additional verification before they could send the funds to his US bank account. And on the 19th of March, after disposing of the Demood bodies, he took the first flight back, straight into the hands of the police. It's worth noting that after the Thai police had discovered the Demood's bodies and traced them back to the scene of the crime, it was apparent that Scripps had become much more brazen. He took a lot less care, leaving behind more blood and DNA evidence in the hotel room where he bludgeoned Sheila and Darren, and in the bathroom where he cut them up, a sign that he was becoming more confident and thought he could escape. But luckily, as he landed at Singapore Changi Airport and pulled out his passport, instead of walking through the gates to enjoy all that Singapore has to offer, he was locked in a reinforced room to be questioned. Although he did not answer any questions or cooperate at all with the police, Scripps did smash a glass panel and try to, unsuccessfully, take his own life. He had been caught with several suspicious items and left behind an enormous paper trail. Even Scotland Yard in the UK had cooperated with the Singaporean police to give them his real name and criminal history. The minor charges for forgery and theft of documentation and money enabled the police to hold Scripps until the prosecution was able to build a case against him for the murder of Gerard Lowe. On the 18th of September 1995, a preliminary inquiry was held, involving statements from 39 witnesses and over 200 pieces of documented evidence. It concluded there was sufficient grounds to proceed with John Martin Scripps' trial for the murder of Gerard, scheduled to begin on the 2nd of October 1995. John Martin Scripps pled not guilty and claimed self-defense, alleging that Gerard had made a sexual advance and attacked him with a hammer, prompting Scripps to strike back fatally. He said a mysterious, quote, British friend, unquote, later disposed of the body, but refused to name him, claiming the man was a drug trafficker who'd harm his family. Scripps insisted he wasn't violent, citing his revulsion at photos of Gerard's dismembered body. He blamed memory loss on alcohol and Valium, yet prosecutors pointed out he'd precisely practiced forging the Demudes' signatures days earlier. To challenge the existence of the unnamed friend, investigators reviewed hotel guest lists. None of the names matched across hotels, and Scripps couldn't recall where this friend had moved. Hotel staff also testified to detecting a foul smell in Scripps' room and seeing him leave with a large suitcase, only to return without it 15 minutes later. This friend likely did not exist. Prosecutors argued the killing was financially motivated. Scripps used Gerard's credit card on a shopping spree and had a history of forging passports to cash checks. The prosecution also highlighted similarities in events with the murders of Sheila and Darren Demude in Thailand and Gerard's murder in Singapore, pointing to a clear pattern: murder solely for money. It took 3 days for the judge to consider his verdict, and on the 10th of November 1995, Scripps was found guilty and sentenced to death. Although he initially tried to appeal, Scripps withdrew it 4 days before the appeal hearing, saying that he, quote, couldn't wait to be executed, unquote. While on death row, Scripps refused all interviews, including with British police, who suspected him in other murders abroad. One victim was Timothy McDowell from London, who vanished in Belize. Police believed Scripps killed him in his sleep and dumped his body in a crocodile-infested river. Just before disappearing, McDowell had transferred £21,000 to Scripps' US account. The second case involved William Shackle, a London accountant who vanished while vacationing in Cancun. Witnesses reported seeing him with a man resembling Scripps as he cashed travelers' checks worth around £4,000. Both cases raised strong suspicions, but were never formally tied to Scripps. In the days before his hanging, it seems that the last person Scripps thought of was Maria. He wrote some poems addressed to her in terrible spelling, but they basically claimed that nobody loved him besides his family and Maria. He also wrote a poem which basically stated that he dreamed of being the one of taking his own life instead of the Singaporean authorities. Maria never responded, but his mother was interviewed and stated that the Singaporean government had no right to execute her son. Although Scripps never spoke to a journalist officially, there were reports that some journalists spoke to him off the record, and although you can find these claims online, I am unable to verify how true this is. It was one criminologist, Christopher Berry D., who's written very popular biographies on numerous serial killers, who did manage to interview Scripps 4 days before he was due to be hanged. In that interview, Scripps described in disturbing detail how he dismembered Gerard's body, and based on what I've read of the interview, he seemed quite proud of it and seemed to savor every detail. He also went on to claim that he wouldn't be hanged because he was British. But on the evening of the 19th of April, 1996, after a last meal of pizza and hot chocolate, John Martin Scripps became the first Westerner to be hanged in Singapore. Thank you for watching. If you like my videos, then please do subscribe and hit the like button. It really helps out the channel. If you want to support the channel, then you can find me on Ko-fi and buy me a coffee with the links in the description. Until next time.